Tej, good to have you with us. So you are the Chief Revenue Officer of Axiom Space, which is building the next international space station. Why is the private sector suddenly interested in the space sector, and where do you see this going?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Lara. It's an interesting question. You said we're building the next international space station. That is correct. The way we describe it is we're building the first commercial space station, and that will be connecting to the existing International Space Station until the International Space Station is decommissioned, deorbited, and then will be the first freestanding commercial structure in space. And the reason the industry is heating up, and particularly why they would hire someone like me from a Google to be in a role like Chief Revenue Officer, is because Axiom Space and several other companies in the industry are now venture capital backed. And this is a big transition for the industry and the market as a whole, because historically space has been almost 100% a government and taxpayer enterprise. And that obviously has different time horizons, spending patterns, values of return, where for venture capitalists, we operate on a 7 to 10 year horizon to show value and financial return to shareholders. So I think by the nature of venture capital, and you saw this in technology over the last several decades, the internet over the last 20 years, it really has a way of fueling and accelerating markets. And the interesting thing about the space economy is whether it's a market or not is yet to be seen, because it was such a historically government and international type of endeavor, an infrastructure type endeavor. To see private companies, venture-backed companies like Axiom Space get in there, I think we're going to see a real acceleration over the next decade.
And how exactly can we monetize a commercial space station?
Currently, there are three primary buckets that we are monetizing the space station, the commercial space station with. The first is human spaceflight. So starting February this next year, so in a few months, we'll be sending our first crewed missions. These are civilians who are going up, purchasing tickets and going to spend 10 days on the International Space Station. And roughly every 6 months moving forward, we'll have missions, crewed missions going up, first to the International Space Station, then Axiom Station. Within human spaceflight, there's also professional astronauts. So countries are purchasing flights and missions with us to go to station. And these are countries that may or may not be part of the current coalition of ISS member countries. The second bucket is media and sponsorship. So you can think of advertising, entertainment as a market that we'd like to develop in commercial space. And the third is research and manufacturing. This is whether it's pharmaceuticals, industrial manufacturing, materials, science. These are doing experiments up on space and then taking it a step further to development and actually building things in space that could be used back home, brought home, or used within space. Now, these are just the current revenue streams and revenue models that we're working on. My belief is that what will happen in building these is we'll discover entirely new markets and industries and use cases and business models that we may have never seen before in human history, and they will create exponential returns just like we've seen in the internet over the last 20, 25 years.
And Tej, what kind of returns are we talking about here?
This is a very interesting question because, as a privately held company with venture capital, when we're out raising money, many times people ask us, what's the total addressable market? And a lot of government spending across many nations has been put towards the International Space Station and space as a whole. And that's actually a very attractive and lucrative market if you take those numbers and apply them to a private enterprise. However, it's not an exact comparison. Like I said, historically, space has been a government and taxpayer funded endeavor. So there are certain infrastructure models that we can look at potentially for return. And there are existing numbers and money spent that we can look at that makes it a very attractive investment, even for venture capital. However, I believe the opportunity is much larger than that. And the biggest opportunity is in what's not known yet. So for example, I keep going back to the internet example. Who would have thought in 1995 that cloud computing would be such a huge part of the economy, right? These were infrastructure investments that companies like Google and Amazon had to make to support their primary consumer business. But in terms of investing in their infrastructure, whether it's data centers, cloud computing, fiber across the ocean, these were services that they were able then to turn around and offer to other companies, which created huge businesses like Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud and other markets. So in terms of the returns, I think, if you look at just regular modeling based on comps, and again, it's not a exact comparison, it is venture capital style returns. But I think what you're really going to see in the next decade is these outsized returns, these exponential returns, these companies that didn't even exist a few years ago that will be the largest companies in the world, or I can say now in the universe.
In which areas exactly do you think that we're going to see the next big investments in space?
I believe the next major investments in the space sector will be in infrastructure. Axiom Space is an example of that. Before we start seeing markets upon markets and new economies and new industries, there has to be that underlying infrastructure, whether that's communications, habitation, life support, transport. You're seeing all these in place right now. And the first big investments, like in any new industry, will be in this infrastructure layer. Soon after that, you'll start seeing it in hardware and software and applications. And I think, from that, we will create an enabling platform for several other types of investments, whether that's research and development in manufacturing and microgravity, whether that be material science or biotech. But before any of that can happen, the underlying infrastructure for space has to be there. And that's where I think the immediate investment will go.